We shall the fluxes module by understanding the fluctuations in the economy. Market economies have regular fluctuations. The economy does not always work smoothly. The short-term fluctuations in economic activity with regard to output, income and prices over time have been called business cycle that extends over a period of several years. In the phase of high income, output and employment, there is either expansion or boom, but at some point when the economy overheats and suffers high prices and interest rates, it reaches a turning point, a peak, and then turns downwards into a recession. Recessions are usually short and are marked by falling employment, output, income, prices and interest rates. Most significantly, it is marked by rising unemployment. The economy will hit a bottom, which is also known as a trough, and rebound into recovery. The recovery will enjoy rising employment, output and income, while unemployment will fall. The income will gradually and eventually slow down as the economy assumes its long-term growth trends and the recovery, and will then transform into an expansion. The government involvement in macroeconomic coordination with the objective of stabilizing the economy is crucial. Fiscal policy and monetary policy are two important instruments of the macroeconomic policy of a government. Fiscal policy comprised of a mix of budgetary instruments, and it refers to use of taxation and government expenditure to influence the aggregate level of economic activities at the macroeconomic level. Monetary policy is changes in the interest rate and changes in the money supply, and it is under the control of the central bank, say in case of India, Reserve Bank of India. The aim of fiscal policy is to achieve the economic objectives with soundness of public finance. The major objectives of fiscal policy are as follows. Firstly, to mobilize resources for sustainable economic growth. Secondly, to achieve the target of full employment. Thirdly, to restrain price instability so as to ensure economic stability. And fourthly, to achieve equitable distribution of income and wealth. The government policies play a significant role in attaining macroeconomic objectives of economic growth, full employment, price stability and distributive justice. In the short term, government may focus on macroeconomic stabilization either using expansionary fiscal policy or contractionary fiscal policy to combat the problem of recession or inflation or external disturbances or natural disaster or spike in the global food or fuel prices. In the long term, the aim may be to fuel sustainable growth or poverty reduction with the actions on the supply side, as the drivers can be development, demographies or natural resource endowments. The developing economy may tilt expenditure towards primary health and education to reduce poverty, whereas in the developed countries, economic expenditure may be for pension reforms or other welfare programs related to aging population. Thus, the broad objectives are shared among the countries, but the relative importance differs across countries depending on the level of the development and on the circumstances of the country. In this module, the role of fiscal policy, which plays a key role in achieving economic stability, would be examined with the help of discretionary fiscal policy or automatic stabilizers. After studying this module, you shall be able to understand the mechanism of fiscal policy, examine the discretionary fiscal policy, and examine the automatic stabilizers working in the economy. Let us now move on to discuss the mechanism of fiscal policy. The fiscal policy of government is used as an active instrument of economic stabilization. This means promoting full employment and stable prices by minimizing the inflationary as well as recessionary fluctuations in the income. This would be possible by reducing or increasing the aggregate demand known as AD. Moreover, if the AD is very low, there will be unemployment, and if the AD is very high, it will lead to inflation. Fiscal policy is the policy of the government which is related to changes in its own expenditure and taxes in order to influence the AD, that is aggregate demand. It is one of the most important demand side policies which focus on changing the AD or shifting the AD curve in the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model in order to achieve the objectives of price stability, full employment and economic growth. Government can use either expansionary or contractionary fiscal policy depending on existing state in the economy. Expansionary fiscal policy increases aggregate demand, whereas contractionary fiscal policy reduces it. Changes in the level, timing and composition of government expenditure and taxation have an important effect on the economy. Keynes in 1936 originally used the identity and formed the basis of modern macroeconomy. The identity is income is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. On the left side is Y, that is income, or GDP, the value of all final goods and services produced in the economy. On the right side are the components of aggregate demand, that is private consumption represented by C, private investment represented by I, government expenditure on goods and services represented by G, and exports minus imports, also called as net exports, represented by NX. The consumption is dependent on disposable income, YD. Disposable income is the income that remains after tax payments, T. That means disposable income YD will be equal to Y minus T. So it has Y and T variables. This equation also makes it evident that government effect macroeconomic activity, that is GDP, controlling G directly and influencing C, I and NX indirectly through changes in taxes, transfers and spending. Fiscal policy that increases AD directly through an increase in government expenditure or lowering taxes is typically called expansionary policy. By the contrast, fiscal policy is often considered to be contractionary policy if it reduces aggregate demand via lower expenditure or higher taxes. Fiscal policy influences all of these components of AD, that is aggregate demand. Government can influence C by imposing taxes on consumers, that is personal income taxes. It can influence I by imposing taxes on business profits. Similarly, government can easily change its own expenditure. Government influences X minus M by means of subsidies provided to the domestic producers, by import tax and so on. The changes in the government expenditure and taxes lead to two macroeconomic effects. First is the multiplier effect and the second is the crowding out effect. government purchases or change in the taxes are said to have a multiplier effect on aggregate demand. Each unit of money spent, say rupee by the government, can eventually raise the AD for goods and services by more than a rupee spent. The multiplier effect refers to the additional shifts in AD that result when the expansionary fiscal policy increases income and thereby increases the consumer spending. The formula for the multiplier is equal to 1 upon 1 minus MPC, where MPC is marginal propensity to consume, which is the fraction of extra income that a household consumes rather than saves. For example, if marginal propensity to consume is 3/4, then the multiplier will be 1 upon 1 minus 3/4, which will come out to be 4 if you solve it. In this case, a rupee 20 billion increase in the government spending generates rupees 80 billion of increased demand for goods and services. Fiscal policy may not affect the economy as strongly as anticipated by the multiplier. An increase in the government expenditure causes the interest rates to rise. A higher interest rate will lead to reduction in the investment spending. Here we are referring to the investment spending by the private sector. When the fiscal expansion increases the interest rate, reducing the AD, this phenomena is called the crowding out effect. The crowding out effect tends to reduce the effects of fiscal policy on aggregate demand. The reverse of crowding out occurs with the contractionary fiscal policy when the government expenditure reduces or tax increase. The effect, which is opposite to the crowding out, is called as crowding in effect. Thus, to minimize fluctuations in prices, output or employment through aggregate demand, the two mechanisms of fiscal policy are discretionary fiscal policy and automatic stabilizers. The two mechanisms will be discussed now. Let us first discuss the discretionary fiscal policy. Fiscal policy can be implemented through either discretionary or automatic measure to stabilize economic fluctuations. The discretionary elements of fiscal policy are deliberate and focused actions taken by the government to increase or decrease aggregate demand. The policy make changes in taxation and public expenditure policies to meet the recessionary and inflationary situations. That implies it is a deliberate policy change by the government. First, let us discuss the fiscal policy to control recession. At the time of recession, government's deliberate action is the expansionary fiscal policy by which the government expenditure is increased or taxes are lowered or cut down, or a combination of both. Expenditure as well as taxes is used to increase the aggregate demand or income. The expansionary policy is followed to close the deflationary gap, that is, when the real output or income falls short of potential output or income, we call it deflationary gap. The increase in the government expenditure tends to lead to two effects. One is multiplier effect and the other is crowding out effect. It was learnt that the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right by an equal amount to the initial change in government expenditure times the multiplier. The increased government expenditure would increase income and increase the consumption. This means more transactions would lead to increase in demand for money, which increases the rate of interest. An important question is how to finance the increase in government expenditure. The increase in government expenditure must not be financed by raising taxes, as it offsets the expansionary effect. As investment is inversely related to rate of interest, the investment will fall and will then partially offset the increase in aggregate demand brought about by the increase in government expenditure. This is due to crowding out of investment or crowding out effect. The expansionary fiscal policy in relation to reduction in taxes increases the aggregate output or income. Next, let us discuss fiscal policy to control inflation. At the time of inflation, the government's deliberate action is the contractionary fiscal policy by which the government expenditure decreases or the taxes are raised, or a combination of both, aimed to decrease the aggregate demand or income. The contractionary policy is followed to close the inflationary gap, that is, when the real output or income is in excess of potential output or income. The AD curve shifts to the left by an equal amount to the initial change in the government expenditure times the multiplier. The decreased government expenditure would decrease income and decrease the consumption. A decrease in government expenditure tends to decrease in demand for money and decrease the interest rate. However, the decrease in income is somewhat offset by the decrease in planned investment resulting from lower interest rate. A contractionary fiscal policy means less expenditure by the government, which hampers the economic growth of a country. So, the government has to strike a balance between growth prospects and crowding out. The contractionary fiscal policy in relation to increase in taxes reduces the disposable income, which further decreases the aggregate demand. Now moving on to discuss the limitations of discretionary fiscal policy. Stabilization goals are not easy to achieve. The existence of various types of time lags in the response of the economy to the stabilization policies can make the economy difficult to control. The effectiveness of discretionary fiscal policy measures for correcting cyclical fluctuations is questionable because of the limitations which I am going to cite now. First limitation is known as recognition lag. This refers to the time needed to recognize the existing of a boom or existence of a recession. It takes time to collect information and prepare even the preliminary estimates for the figures collected. For example, if the economy goes into recession on January 1, it may not be detected instantly until the statistical information for the first quarter is collected and analyzed. There is a lag between collection of information and application of fiscal measures for correcting economic instability. Government cannot change its fiscal policy overnight in response to fluctuations in income and output. It requires statistical information for the formulation of tax policy or expenditure policy. Hence, there is a recognition lag in the effective implementation of fiscal policy. Second problem is known as implementation lag. The time it takes to put the desired policy for correcting fluctuations into effect once economists and policymakers recognize that the economy is in boom or recession is known as implementation lag. The government cannot change the decisions instantly as it involves the approval of the parliament or administrative decision making through annual budget. Thus, the implementation lag undermines the effectiveness of fiscal policy. Third lag is known as execution lag, the time that it takes for the economy to adjust to new condition after a new policy is implemented. It is the time lag between decision taken by the government and its execution. The change in fiscal policy may not have immediate effect. For example, a government expenditure increases or tax cut, the individuals or firms would not revise their spending plans instantly. Thus, it would not stimulate extra private spending with extra government spending or tax cut. Next, we shall move on to discuss the automatic stabilizers. Earlier, we had discussed the discretionary stabilizers. The second type of fiscal policy is built into the structure of taxes and expenditure and help counter fluctuations in the business cycle. This is referred to as the non-discretionary fiscal policy, or more commonly automatic stabilizers. They enact counter-cycle policy without the lags associated with discretionary policy changes. No political decisions are required and therefore implementation lags are minimized. It reduces the impact of recession and inflation and helps in ensuring economic stability. The automatic stabilizers ensure a prompter and self-correcting fiscal response. They operate in relation to the business cycle. The built-in stability of taxes and government expenditure, of transfer payments and subsidies pattern automatically raise aggregate demand in times of recession and reduce aggregate demand at the time of inflation without any deliberate action by the government or parliament. The changes in the expenditure and taxes that occur through automatic stabilizers do not shift the aggregate demand curve because they are automatic. The important automatic stabilizers include personal income tax, corporate income tax, transfer payments such as unemployment compensation, social security schemes and welfare benefits. The working of automatic stabilizers depends on the size of government but also on how responsive taxes and expenditures are to the cyclical fluctuations and the progressivity of the tax system. For instance, consider the decline in real income during the recession. The decline in economic activity would automatically reduce tax payments, reducing the impact of downturn on personal disposable income. This would increase transfer payments, boosting disposable income even further. Rising transfer payments and falling tax collections help households from the impact of recession. Let us understand the factors affecting the automatic stabilizers. First one is the size of the government. Automatic stabilizers are related to the size of the government and are likely to be larger in advanced economies. Where stabilizers are larger, there may be less need for discretionary fiscal policy. In many low income and emerging market economies, due to institutional limitations and narrow tax bases, the automatic stabilizers are relatively weak. Second is the tax structure. Taxes act as automatic stabilizers. Revenue from direct and indirect taxes is dependent upon the level of economic activities. Direct taxes like personal income tax or corporate tax, which is the tax which companies or corporates pay as a percentage of their profits to the government. These taxes are progressive in nature and rise more than proportionately with increase in income during the boom and decrease during the recession. The tax structure is so designed that the revenue from these taxes varies directly with income. When national income increases during expansion or inflation, the higher rates on higher income would decline the disposable income, thereby reducing the people's consumption and thus reducing the aggregate demand, resulting in contractionary effect. On the other hand, at the time of recession, the decline of revenue prevents the decline in aggregate demand by the same proportion as the decline in income, resulting the expansionary effect. Progressive taxes like income tax increases the tax revenue during inflation, pushing people into higher income brackets and thereby reducing government budget deficit or increasing government surplus. During recession, the government budget deficits increase or reduces government surplus because many individuals fall into lower tax brackets or they do not have any tax liability. The income reduces and unemployment increases. Third is the expenditure structure. Expenditure programs, in particular unemployment benefits, transfer payments, subsidies, subsidies to farmers, targeted cash transfer program, food stamps, public work programs, social benefit programs, all these have a stabilizing impact on disposable household income that enhances the income of the poor household at the time of recession. Unemployment insurance programs are important in advanced economies, although much less widespread in developing economies such as India. In the developing economies, welfare augmented programs works during the recession that reduces the poverty and gives them social benefits. At the time of recession, the output and income falls and as a result, unemployment increases. The government has to spend more on unemployment benefits and other welfare programs to reduce poverty and enhance income. This government expenditure tends to make recession short-lived and automatically expansionary. It is important to note that the automatic stabilizers also raise key policy issues as it may have effects on the other fiscal policy goals. If the raise in automatic stabilizers is achieved by raising the tax and expenditure level, then equity goals might be enhanced by a larger size of the government along with the higher progressivity, but would have efficiency cost. Now we will summarize what we have learnt in this module. Fiscal policy comprises a mix of budgetary instruments that government use to target economic objectives of the country, that is, the achievement of economic growth, distributive justice, price stability and full employment. It is the use of government spending and taxation that result of the deliberate changes of the government to influence the economy. Fiscal policy has two effects, multiplier effect and crowding out effect on the economy. When the government alters spendings or taxes, the resulting shifts in the aggregate demand can be larger or smaller than the fiscal change. The multiplier effect tends to magnify the effects of fiscal policy on aggregate demand. The crowding out effect tends to diminish the effect of fiscal policy on aggregate demand. Discretionary fiscal policy increases government expenditure and cut taxes during recession that result in increase in aggregate demand. This is expansionary fiscal policy. At the time of inflation, government expenditure reduced and increase in taxes decrease aggregate demand. This is contractionary fiscal policy. Fiscal policy changes are not so easy to formulate and implement due to time lags at every step that cause delays and difficulties in the response of the economy to macroeconomic policies. The delays and time lags in implementation of fiscal policy and the possibility of non-reversal when required introduce instability in the economy. Automatic stabilizers are revenue and expenditure items in the government budget that automatically change the state of the economy and tend to stabilize income and output. No political decisions are required and implementation lags are minimized. The working of automatic stabilizers depend on the size of government but also on how responsive taxes and expenditures are to the cyclical fluctuations and the progressivity of the tax system. At the time of recession, the government automatically takes in more expenditure increasing budget deficit, whereas during inflation, the government automatically takes in more revenue reducing budget deficit or increasing the budget surplus.